Hello, my name is David Rohde, and this channel is going to be about how we can use machine learning to do personalization for recommender systems that's really reward optimizing, that really brings value to business metrics, things we really should care about. It's a little bit of a niche topic, and I'm searching for an audience. So if you're into this kind of thing, please do the like and subscribe thing. And what I'm going to do is a little bit go over a backlog over articles I've written for the Causal Python newsletter. And I've got about 10. They're also available on my blog here. And the first one is kind of a good introductory one, which is around how important is causal inference for recommender systems? Is it really something that's of fundamental importance, and should it be? And if it's not, why is it not? And you can read my post here if you're interested. But in this video, I'm going to give a little bit of a summary of what my take is, which is it ought to be pretty important. Recommender systems are meant to bring value. They're meant to help users navigate the system, and they're meant to bring value to the owner that operates them. So these are all causal effects of the system. So it makes a good deal of sense that we should be using causal ideas here. And in practice, not so much. And there's a story here. Why does it seem like it ought to be useful, and why is it not actually useful in practice? And that's what I'm going to talk about in this video, and it's going to be what I'm talking about in this post. And actually, it's a big theme of a book I'm writing, and the book will hopefully be out next year. But I'll introduce a lot of these ideas right here. So in terms of how causal inference might seem to be relevant to recommender systems, an industry standard is to do A/B testing, which is just really another name for the randomized control trial. And this is, I think, to most people, a fundamental gold standard idea in causality. So in that sense, that causal idea has widespread adoption. And there are other ideas of like click models and things like this that are taking some sort of user signal that are also have widespread adoption. But you see a lot of ideas as well. And it's actually very difficult, I think, to only do things from a causal point of view. And that's really the story that I'm going to tell in this video, which is a little bit expanding upon the story I tell in this blog post. So let's um, let's now jump to a little introductory example that will help explain what happens in a real system. So here's the hero of our story, and they become known to the recommended system at some point in time, and they advance. And usually with a recommender system, the user will do things that will illustrate that they have interest that are not actually engaging with the recommender system here. And that's what I'm meaning here in this example is the user is reading some content or engaging with some content that's related to technology as indicating that the user may be interested in technology. And there could be multiple of these events before the recommender system is ever triggered. So we have a second one, a third one. And like, so this user might have three interests or at least indications of three interests. And then finally, the recommender system is called. And it's usually always called and the request for more than one recommended item. So here we see a computer, a phone, and some couscous. So some things that the recommender system might suggest that the user is interested in. And at this point, the user might click or not click, or they might respond to those recommendations, or they just could return to the base system, ignoring the recommendations that are in these side panels. I think we've all done this at some point. And then they can engage with more content, perhaps not from the recommender systems, or perhaps from it, that's giving information that they're interested in science. And there can be sale events or other high value events. But in an advertising system, which is where I have my background, there'd likely be sale events, and there can be more engagement, more recommendations. They can do more trigger more events that indicate their interest again, and more high value events. And so this is what a real user timeline looks like. There are multiple times that the recommender system is triggered, and there are multiple recommendations coming from the system. And usually when we do an A/B test, we'll just call the system A. And this system, it's often called a policy. You could also think of it as a protocol that says, well, in this situation, I'm going to recommend these things. So it's a complex engineering system that does personalized recommendation is the policy or the protocol, and here we're going to call it pi A. So the A/B test then is simply looking at the system, and you're looking at the users that are allocated to pi A, looking at the users that are allocated to pi B, and measuring something. And usually you'll get a measurement that's roughly the same, but you'll find one is a bit higher and one is a bit lower. you get a pretty good and pretty rigorous measurement of something that you might care a lot about, like the sale. You could also put the click in this table, but you are absolutely entitled and able to put a high value event like a sale. Or if you're interested in a subscription service, you could also look at churns and things like this. Okay, so this is good. We're getting a good causal measurement here, but what's a problem is that you're not very easily able to do anything other than measure two systems. What I'm wanting to do is build a new system and work out what pi should be. If I don't think it should be pi r or pi b, so here I think that pi b is probably better. I'd switch to pi b, but maybe there are some instances when pi a is better, or maybe pi a and pi b. In fact, typically they will also each do a bit of randomized experimentation. They might find items that are neither pi or, personalized recommendations that are neither the common item from pi a or pi b or the preferred item that really ought to be because they're good recommendations. And there's no real way of doing that very easily here. And so I'll switch to a simpler problem that we sometimes pretend we have. In fact, I'd say we frequently pretend we have this problem, but it doesn't look at all like the real problem. And that's where we have the user, they arrive, we get a single event that shows their interest, but not more. There's a single recommendation event with only one item in it. And then there's either a click or a non-click on this. And I say click or a non-click because that higher value event usually doesn't happen immediately after a recommendation. So we're somewhat restrained to saying, okay, well, now we're only going to look at the click. Of course, it's never the preferred business metric, but it is an indication of engagement with an actual specific recommendation. So if we have lots of records like this, as opposed to the A/B test, then we can get different personalization. We could try different things. So on the sport thing, we can try recommending the tennis racket as well as the phone. Maybe the tennis racket is going to have a better click-through rate. And we can do that for also all possible categories for the science and the couscous. You could do complete randomized experimentation. You could do an A/B test where if you have an A/B test, you will likely have on every context a preferred single action. Or you could have a bit of a mix of both, or like a preferred action and some exploration. You could have all of these, but so long as there's some exploration, you might be able to do some learning on a system like this. And if you were to do this, you will then be able to estimate the click-through rate for all of these interests. In this case, science, sport, music, technology, food, fashion, for all of these items. In this case, it's the computer, the retro phone, the couscous, the telescope, and the tennis racket. And you can produce this estimate, and then you're kind of doing the causal analysis I said at the start was pretty difficult, but you can see that we're doing it on a simplified problem that isn't a real problem in most real systems. There's also a problem with doing this in practice as well. Although you could almost do this under some limited circumstances, it's difficult to do. But there is an important advantage that's worth noting, which is here we were only talking about a process. And in here, in fact, we could build a process from all of these items, because what we could do here is build a new policy, because we can look at each of these categories, science, sport, music, technology, and we can find the ordered items to recommend on each of them by the ordered estimate of the CTR. So that means we can produce a completely new policy that we would judge likely to be optimal to either of the two that we were running previously. So it's a big improvement, but it's required a massive simplification in the problem. Now let's talk about how we could actually do this. And I'm going to put down some numbers for an example to just show you that this isn't necessarily possible to do either. So let's say we have 4.9 billion users. So that's about half the population of the world, or 4.9 billion records. Okay, let's maybe be a bit loose with this, but the whole notion of the experimentation would be cleanest if they were individual users. Let's say we have 1,000 recommendable items. So that's a pretty small recommendation set. Even if you're doing one item at a time, a recommendation set of size 1 million is not even considered large. And if there are combinations of recommendations, you'd expect it to be really to be a combinatorial explosion on that. And let's say we're going to have also 1,000 interests, and dividing that, and I'll assume that the interests are all equally probable. So we'll just see all of them equally. Then of the 4.9 billion users, we're going to see 4,900 for every interest item pair. So we have a bit of signal in for each pair. That's not too bad. Let's assume that we have a click-through rate of 1%. So that's a decent click-through rate, so not too low. So just some basic um, calculations, we'll get about 49 clicks uh, for every pair. The variance is about 1%. That's because the variance of Bernoulli is p times 1 take p, and well, if p is very low, it's more or less p. Um, and so that the sigma is the square root of that at 0.1. And we can compute a standard error by dividing the sigma by the square root of n. And here we get it to be about 0.0014. So it's about 15% of the signal that we're measuring. So that we're saying the click-through rate is about 1%, and we have an error of plus or minus 15, 14%, right? So that's not brilliant, but it's also not too bad. And so if we start putting error bars down, as I've got these green error bars down, then you may be able to detect things. You can do things with it with a sort of signal that this is strong, but it's going to depend on an additional thing. I've said the click-through rate is 1%, but it's clearly not 1% everywhere, right? We're interested in finding for the science category, which is the only one I'm now highlighting, which of these items has the highest click-through rate. And there's going to be some difference between the best item, maybe it's 2%, or maybe the best item is 10%. It could be any kind of spread here. And your ability to reliably detect which is the best item is going to depend on how, not on the error that we've just calculated, but also what that spread is. And so if the spread is a lot, you're much more likely to be able to measure it, and it's got a lot more value. So that's a nice thing that occurs here, is if there's more value, then you're going to be more able to detect it. So, but you could easily can see cases where the error bars are overlapping like this, or if the signals are a bit more spread out, you might be able to then, it's not that you're necessarily going to find the best item, but you're going to find a good item, and you may not be able to distinguish between a range of good items, depending on how they spread out. But you can do useful things here. But my example is pretty silly. The example is 1,000 interests. It's maybe okay, but it's a lot of people would want to have more interests. We want to do very fine-grained personalization these days. 1,000 items, and a whopping 4.9 billion events to train on, and I'd like to say they're users. And we're doing complete exploration. There's no exploitation at all occurring. So all of these are resulting in a very strong, even signal across those 1 million records. What if we up it a little bit by, let's say we have 10,000 records and 500 million users? Well, that means that we've got 49 users in each bin of interest item pair. And our click-through rate is 1%. We're expecting half a click in each one. How are we supposed to estimate these click-through rates that are around 1%? If we then do the standard error calculation, we see that the standard error calculation is now 10 times higher because of the root n. So there's 100 times less data, but the standard error is 10 times higher. And in fact, the standard error is now 40% higher than the signal you're trying to measure. And I mean, this is just a graphical illustration. Obviously, you can't do very much in such a situation. And this is a pretty standard situation. So this is a sort of second reason why being purely causal might not work in a real system. The first reason being that there are multiple events, what the large language model people call the multi-turn problem. And the second being that the signal is too difficult to estimate because this cross between the interest and the item recommended is too large in size. There are too many combinations, and usually also too small in magnitude. The differences between these different types of recommendations is also relatively small. So that also is interesting. And so what could we do, and why would we not do causal stuff? What you actually find is that a lot of people use some kind of relevant signal here. They'll use a signal that has nothing to do with reward, not even like this near-term reward clicks, but they will use collaborative filtering. They will use embeddings of content. You can take the descriptions of the interests and the descriptions of the item. You can embed them with BERT or your favorite large language model, take it in a product between the embeddings, and you'll get some kind of signal very quickly that has some sort of information in it, but it's not related to the A/B test performance. And so that's my story about why causality is always not at the heart of recommender systems and the way they're built. Thanks for your interest. Cheers.